الكيفيات الكميات.
Si connexe. Sempre.
Yes, yes.
Why it's not?
Neither real nor unreal, neither eternal nor momentary.
Hello.
Well, we all have a dark side, but you don't have to know you have it.
Just to let everyone know, we're working on audio issues, so nothing has been said yet that needs to be heard.
The gardener would appreciate that. While we're working on this, I do want to just remind everyone of how precious it is that we have everyone here by helping us in this way, and that it is quite wonderful. I really appreciated hearing from Molly about the kind of giving economy in these festivals that like Burning Man that she's been studying. And
It's the wrong mic.
This is also
That's the old mic.
No wonder.
this is also a giving economy, right? This is the dana economy. Dana is that Sanskrit word for giving, generosity. So it's wonderful to participate in that, and I appreciate everyone doing so. Are we ready? It was all my fault. Your settings window.
My mic is now on. How's that? Okay.
Your settings window is showing. It probably does. Yes. I just thought it would be fun to say. Yes, exactly. Showing my settings. Are we good?
Okay.
Great. So I'll just very briefly say we're going to once again have a session this morning from Richie. Then we're going to hear a response actually online from Al Kazniak. Then we're going to hear from Adam Frank, and I will do a brief response to that. We'll have some time for conversation, maybe a little Q&A. Break until 2 p.m. We'll have lunch and break until 2 p.m. And then we'll hear from Andreas Rupsdorf at 2. And a response, I hope, from Gabor Karshai, although he doesn't know that yet. Or maybe he does if he got the email. And then we'll all gather together to have a conversation and hopefully some time for Q&A as well. So that's the overview of the day. It was quite a wonderful day yesterday. At least I felt so. Really just amazing to hear from my colleagues and the conversations that have come up. And I'm sure we're going to hear things today that will be just as wonderful, starting with my friend and colleague, Richie Davidson. So probably Richie really doesn't need any introduction to you all. He's the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds, has some kind of position then in our nonprofit Healthy Minds Innovations that's created the Healthy Minds program, which I think he might talk a little bit about today. He's known as an affective neuroscientist. It was really important in developing that field, but has grown into something that's much larger than that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Richie to start us out with a little settling and then for a great presentation. Richie?
Thank you, dear John. Appreciate it. So let's just take a couple of moments to gather our awareness. We can close our eyes since we'll be looking at a screen soon. And perhaps let's begin with just a little bit of appreciation for the extraordinary opportunity that we have here at Upaya for the care that we are receiving from all the residents, from the indefatigable work of Noah and all of his 1,000 arms. And for the wisdom and grace of Roshi, it's just such a blessing to be here and to be together. So let's open our eyes and engage, and with that sense of appreciation, begin. So this morning, I'm going to talk about this issue of scaling human flourishing. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is fond to remind us that there are 8 billion people now on the planet, and that every one of us has the capacity to be happy and to flourish. And that it is not only possible, but we would say that we have a moral responsibility to do everything we can to enable, to create the causes and conditions that afford the maximal possibility for human flourishing. Because if we don't, the very future of humanity as we know it is really on the line. And so this is a subject that we've become obsessed with over the last few years and are trying to do our small part in helping to nudge this along. And so I'm going to be sharing a few reflections about the journey that we and others have been on that relate to this theme. And it will be in a few different sections, and I'll say what they are as we move along. So I want to start with bad news. And I promise you I will move to good news. But let's begin with recent bad news that was in the form of a public health advisory from the Surgeon General of the United States. And the public health advisory was on loneliness. So this was issued just a few weeks ago by the Surgeon General. And I want to just show you one key data point in the Surgeon General's report. Actually, a couple of data points. These are findings on trends in social connection from 2003 to 2020. And one of the important points here is that this is not something that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been going on way before the pandemic began and was exacerbated by the pandemic. So in the first panel on the upper left is social isolation, and on the ordinate, on the y-axis, is the annual daily average in minutes of these various activities. And this first activity is social isolation, and there was a dramatic inflection point that was associated with an increase in social isolation over the last several years. Household family engagement. This is time that a family spends together. And you can see this downward trend, a decrease of 5 hours per month over this period of time. And you can see this trend line is such that it began before the pandemic and continued. Companionship. And companionship here is, it refers to the shared leisure time for the sake of enjoyment and intrinsic satisfaction with others. And there has been a systematic decrease in companionship, a dramatic decrease in social engagement with friends, and a decrease in non-household family social engagement and social engagement with others. And all of these parameters of social connection, there has been a systematic decrease. Now, what may be surprising to some of you is that loneliness is more dangerous than smoking 15 cigarettes a day in its impact on human health. So these are data showing the odds of premature mortality, starting with lack of social connection. And you can see that social connection or social disconnection trumps 15 cigarettes a day in its impact on mortality. And so it's important to recognize that this important element of well-being and flourishing, social connection, is an element that gets under the skin and affects not just our psychological well-being or our emotional well-being, but it also affects our physical health. Now, we've been doing a lot of work with teachers, public school teachers in the K through 12 space. This work started before the pandemic, but it was accelerated during the pandemic because this was a sector that reached out to us and asked for help because teachers' well-being was going through the basement, and it was impacting, and it is impacting, students' ability to learn. And as part of work that we and others have been doing, and the next two slides are just data from baseline data from some work that we've been doing both with public school teachers in Wisconsin and a second larger group of public school teachers in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's looking at three parameters: stress, anxiety, symptoms, and depression. And I won't go through all the details of these data, but suffice it to say that more than 70% of teachers are reporting moderate or severe or extremely severe symptoms of anxiety, and more than 50% are reporting moderate or extreme symptoms of depression. And these data are largely replicated in a sample of public school teachers in Louisville, Kentucky. And this is just representative of one sector, but we see very similar trends in many different sectors, including healthcare, first responders, as well as the workplace. So I've already alluded a little bit to the fact that well-being matters, but I want to share with you a study that was done, published a number of years ago, looking at the relation between well-being and longevity across the world. This is a study in 151 different countries, and what you can see here on the y-axis is life expectancy, and on the x-axis is a measure of well-being, and this is across nations. And you can see that those nations in whom the citizens are reporting higher levels of well-being are actually living longer. And this association is a very strong one, surprisingly strong. It is one of many indications that well-being matters. Okay, so that's the bad news. Now, there was a lot of bad news at many points in the United States history of social injustices in our country. And one of the things that is really important to remember is that when Martin Luther King gave his famous speech in Washington, the title was not "I Have a Nightmare," but having a dream of a different mode of being. Is really part of the solution. And this really goes back to work that we heard yesterday, to Molly's beautiful presentation about the stories we tell ourselves in self-fulfilling prophecies. And having a dream of a different way of relating is so vital in shifting our mindsets. And a very important principle is that the same mechanisms that in our biology encode suffering, mechanisms specifically of neuroplasticity and epigenetics, can be harnessed for awakening. The very same mechanisms. So for example, we know that trauma affects our biology. It changes our brains, it changes our epigenetics. Those very same mechanisms can be harnessed and changed through awakening, through practices designed to promote human flourishing. And there's now overwhelming evidence for that. And this underscores the possibility of change, of transformation. So this is a data point that we're really quite concerned about. Only 15% of the population, based on lots of different surveys, are actively engaged in a broad range of activities using a very liberal kind of criteria, are engaged in activities to promote their own well-being. What about the other 85%? How can we reach the other 85%? And this goes back to His Holiness's admonition of all of the beings on this planet and the responsibility that we have to help promote flourishing of all, not only of people who sign up to listen to our lectures, but to people who never heard of the fact that well-being could be nourished. So one of the things that we have found helpful is going back to some principles in Buddhism of view, meditation, and application, and looking at some work in modern psychology and neuroscience that may relate to different elements of this. And so one of the understandings in Buddhism is that we put our butts on the cushion and meditate in order to help us remember to bring the view to every nook and cranny of our everyday life. We don't put our butts on the cushion for some experience that we have while meditating primarily. What really matters is how the meditation changes our sensibility, our mode of being, if you will. And this is why Dan Goleman and I wrote the book that we titled Altered Traits. It's a play on altered states, because what really counts is what endures. If meditation were just about what happens on the cushion, it would be like a drug. And once we stop meditating, the effects would dissipate. That's not why we meditate. We meditate because of its impact on everyday life, because it helps us to remember to bring the view to every nook and cranny and to apply that in all of the different contexts of our lives. And so one question that we've asked is whether for people, the 85% who are not meditating, can we somehow give them a taste of the view, if you will? Give them a taste of a different mindset. And the empirical question is, does that matter? Can that actually make a difference? Can it produce some benefit? Because if we're realistic with ourselves, most of the population is not going to do what we do. And so how can we bring some of the insights to this larger group? So I'm going to now share with you a bunch of different findings from a broad array of scientific literature, and most of this work has been published in some of the very best scientific journals in the world. And this is work from many different scientists. And it was not done from a Buddhist perspective. It was not done from a contemplative perspective. But one way to interpret this is that these are very, very brief interventions that in one way or another are bringing some aspect of the view and elevating that mindset within the awareness of these participants, and then looking to see how it affects their experience and their behavior. So let me give you a few examples. This is really quite an extraordinary study that was published a number of years ago with low-income Black families in the Northeast of the United States. And what they did is a incredibly simple, what we would call a micro support, a very brief intervention to elevate certain values and have them be more incorporated into the mindset of these teenagers. And so the intervention consisted of, at 4 points over the course of 1 year, having kids write about a list of values, and they can choose any one of them, and they wrote for 10 minutes. And they were given a list. So values like family, community, our country, values of that sort. And they were asked to write for 10 minutes about their how those values are important in their life. And so the total intervention in this case was 40 minutes, 4 times 10 minutes over the course of 1 year. And the kids, when they did this, were 15 years of age. They tracked them for 7 years after that. And here's what the data show. It turns out that among these African-American kids, the kids in the black bar who received this 40-minute intervention were significantly more likely 7 years later to graduate from a 4-year college. Significantly more likely to graduate from a 4-year college from a total of 40 minutes. And if you look at a measure of the selectivity of the college, they were significantly more likely to go to a more selective college. And this was a randomized controlled trial. So this is an example of the power of these kinds of very brief interventions. Let me give you another example that relates to our biology. A very similar kind of intervention, except it was even briefer, where they wrote for just a few minutes about values that were important to themselves. And then they went into a Trier social stress test, which is one of the many ways we've learned to ethically torture people in the laboratory safely, without a lot of side effects. And what it does, basically it's having a person give a speech before a live audience, and they are giving this speech, and they're spitting every few minutes, and the stress hormone cortisol is assayed from their saliva. And so here are data from a control group and the group who are given the values affirmation intervention. And what you can see is that this incredibly brief intervention, that's a few minutes, is actually dramatically changing their stress biology. So another study, and I won't go into this one in detail, but this is looking at changes in the brain and behavior. This was among people who were extremely sedentary. And they did another values affirmation task that also involved writing, and this was less than 5 minutes. And what the study looks at is the percentage of days that they were completely sedentary after this very brief intervention. And what the data show is that for those people whose brains change the most in specific regions in response to this incredibly brief intervention, just a few minutes, they show significant increases in their movement, becoming less sedentary over time. And this goes out to 30 days, just from a few minutes. And then I'm just going to show you 2 more of these. This is an amazing study that was done with teachers who were given a very brief intervention that lasted 7 minutes to help them develop a more empathic response to disciplining children in their classrooms. And what they found from this 7-minute intervention is that, is that if you look over in the right bars is a summary for those kids that had prior suspensions, when the teacher received this 7-minute intervention to strengthen their empathy, they were significantly less likely to be the kids that they were teaching were significantly less likely to be suspended. From 7 minutes of an intervention. The children, so this was an intervention with the teachers, and the trickle-down effect on the students was such that the suspension rate was literally cut in half. Okay, one last one. This was published just a couple of, maybe 2 weeks ago in Science. And this was an amazing study that was done with about 29,000 students in 22 colleges and universities across America. And it involved another really brief intervention that related to belonging. And the question that they examined is the extent to which, or the percentage of students who received this intervention who then completed their first year of college. And when kids drop out of college, they often drop out in their first year. And this is where we lose many kids to successfully completing college. And what the data show is that those kids who come from historically low achieving groups are the ones who benefit most from this intervention. And again, this intervention is less than 10 minutes, and it led to a dramatic increase in the rate at which these children completed their first year of college. So this is just a kind of smorgasbord of different findings to show that delivered at the right time in the right place, incredibly brief interventions can make an enormous difference and have kind of outsized consequences. In our own work, and I'll just give you a little taste of this, we've been doing a lot of work with public school teachers, particularly during the pandemic, and it's based around this framework of understanding 4 key pillars of well-being. And I won't go into this in detail, but these pillars are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And we've developed a really short training in each of these key pillars of well-being. And teachers on average that we gave this program to engaged in these practices across these 4 pillars of well-being for, on average, about 4.5 minutes per day. And they did this for 30 days. And they did it through an app that we've developed called the Healthy Minds Program, which, by the way, is freely available. So you can download it, it's totally free. And what we see in randomized controlled trials is WL stands for the Weightless Control, HMP is the Healthy Minds Program. These are in public school teachers in different parts of the United States. And what we see is a dramatic reduction in measures of psychological distress that persist for at least 16 weeks after the intervention ends. And we also did a study of a very similar kind just before COVID. And we followed the teachers during COVID, and we asked the simple question, how many of you are still teaching full time? And some of you, I'm sure, are aware of the extraordinary crisis we have here in the United States and also in other countries of a critical shortage of teachers. And what we found is that those teachers that were randomly assigned to our well-being intervention were 6 times more likely to still be teaching during COVID full-time than the randomly assigned counterparts who did not receive this intervention. And a cost-benefit analysis showed that just on the retention data alone, there was a $3.34 return on the investment for every $1 invested in the intervention. So I'm going to switch gears now and just say a few things about innate basic goodness. And so this is really connects to Molly's beautiful talk yesterday and takes it a little further by suggesting that maybe there is an answer to this question. The answer, I would say, is indeed that human beings do have innate basic goodness, but we forget that we have this. And Molly used the word yesterday, excavation. And I think it's a very apt term. We need to excavate in our minds and our hearts to reconnect to this innate basic goodness. But I want to just show you the data that really support this. I'm not going to go through this in any detail. This is a beautiful review by Kylie Hamlin that was published a number of years ago, all in preverbal infants. And these different paradigms for assessing this. And I'll show you in detail the first of these paradigms that involve completely non-social objects, but that humans attribute social intention to. I'm going to just show you 2 very short video clips. There's sound, but it's not coming through. I got it. I did it. It's on there. Okay, which of those 2 videos do you think 6-month-old infants prefer? Yeah, of course, one question which you also should ask is, how do you ask a 6-month-old infant which it prefers? And there are many ways to ask. You can look at the duration of their gaze. You can look at which they smile in response to. The data show, and I went back and checked on this very recently from this was one of the original studies that showed this. It's not like 55% of infants show this preference compared to 45. The data show that it's like 100% of the infants show this preference. 100% in this original 2007 study. 100%. So these are very strong data that suggest that we do come into the world with this preference. So we're born to be kind, but kindness and related qualities need to be cultivated to endure. And these pro-social qualities have dramatic impact for our planet. And I want to just show you data from another study on this idea or notion of social mindfulness as a kind of pro-sociality and how it actually is related to certain environmental policies of nations across the world. So the measure that was used in this particular study is a really interesting one. But before I show you the measure, let me describe to you what it is. Have you ever been in a situation where you're in a restaurant and you've ordered an appetizer and there are like 4 pieces of the appetizer, and you are with maybe 5 people, and so you're faced with a kind of mini moral dilemma. Should you just take maybe a little teeny taste of one of the pieces to leave food on the plate for the others that you're with? That is how social mindfulness in this particular study was operationalized. And it was done behaviorally with a really clever behavioral task. And I won't go into the details, but essentially it involved just what I described, where you're given a choice. So here are different kinds of apples. Which would you choose? Would you choose the one green one, knowing that there would be one other person who would be offered a choice after you? Or would you choose a red one, knowing that there are 2 red ones? So you'd allow that other person to have a choice. So it turns out that nations vary in the population average of this metric of social mindfulness. And this is a plot of nations in different parts of the world. I wanted to mention for Anna, where Sweden falls, it's really, yes, it's a great data point in having super high levels of social mindfulness. And what is on the x-axis is this measure, EPI, which ranks countries on 24 performance indicators across 10 categories covering environmental health and ecosystem vitality. And what it shows is that countries that have citizens with high levels of social mindfulness also have, in general, higher EPI scores. They are making more ecologically intelligent decisions. So in the last couple of minutes, how much time do I have? Okay, great. So a little bit on technology and well-being. And this, I mentioned this in the abstract that I wrote, and Richie specifically asked me to comment on this. And there are a few things to say. The first is, after the Surgeon General issued his health advisory on loneliness, just a few days ago, he issued another health advisory on social media and youth mental health. And the one key data point from this health advisory is from a study that was published in 2019 before COVID. And what it shows is the relationship between time spent on social media among adolescents and internalizing, which are anxiety and depression problems, and externalizing, which are more antisocial kinds and impulsivity problems, and also comorbid problems, which you often see particularly in adolescence. And what you can see is a linear relationship between the amount of time teens spend on social media and the comorbid anxiety or internalizing and externalizing problems. And the data are really quite strong in showing that kids with who spend more than 3 hours a day are showing rates of comorbid problems that exceed 15%. And so this is really becoming a serious problem. And also data show that today teenagers in our country spend on average 3.5 hours a day on social media. So one important, I think, consequence of this is we need to figure out ways to educate for digital hygiene. The technology is not going to go away, but our relationship to the technology can, and I think many people would argue should, change. The average adult in the United States opens their phone 152 times a day based on a recent study. I think most of us would agree that that's just not necessary. And we can still enjoy the fruits that our devices provide without being hijacked by them. And so incorporating digital hygiene into our educational systems, I think, is really going to be important. So one question is, what is technology good for, and in what crucial ways is AI limited? And one of the things I wanted to just say is there's so much hype about virtual reality and the metaverse, and I wanted to make an important distinction between virtual reality and augmented reality. Augmented reality is where technology can be used to superimpose information on real world perception. And so heads-up displays that you see sometimes in modern cars is an example of augmented reality. And there may be ways of inserting micro interventions, micro supports, using augmented reality, if you will, that is context sensitive. And this is something that we are actively exploring in our work today to remind people. So for example, a teacher, before she or he starts their day, spend 1 minute reflecting on your purpose in becoming a teacher. Before a meeting, spending a minute appreciating some positive qualities of the people we're meeting with. Using augmented reality, we can actually do things of that sort that potentially could be beneficial. The other thing I wanted to point out is biology is wet and it's analog. Two things that AI is not. I want to just list some of the characteristics of our human intelligence that so far are completely opaque to AI. One is touch, another is smell, pheromones, intersubjectivity, interpersonal synchrony, contagion effects. All those kinds of things are just beyond what any AI today is remotely approaching. And one of the biggest sort of media hype around AI these days is around large language models, which are exceedingly powerful and potentially useful and also potentially dangerous. But it's important to recognize that they're all based on language. It's all based on language. And one of the things that I was sharing earlier with my colleagues here is I often urge my trainees at some point in their career to spend time with organisms that cannot talk. Because so much of human intelligence goes beyond language. And if what we are restricting our intelligence to is that which is represented in language, we are by definition myopic in our perspective. So finally, I want to just end with some further reflections about the farther reaches of the view. Among those of us who are steeped in practice, the view becomes really extraordinarily important in navigating our everyday lives. And there are some scientists who've attempted to approach this in their understanding of long-term practice. And in this really interesting article that was published last year on expertise in meditation practice, there are a few really interesting speculations in here. And some of them have been, go beyond speculation. There's some empirical validation of some of this. In the top left-hand figure, there is a hypothetical graph of effort. And what it shows is that in the midpoint of practice, if you will, in the developing meditator, there's strong effort, but with expertise, it becomes effortless. And in fact, there are neural signs of that effortlessness that we and others have observed in studies in very, very long-term meditation practitioners that we've done. And on the right is a figure that is quite interesting in suggesting that with advanced practitioners, and particularly with certain kinds of practice, there is an entrainment or a synchronization between the brain and the external environment. And when there is asynchrony between the brain and the external environment, that is the causes and conditions, at least in part, that set up a subject-object duality. But when there is complete synchronization between the brain and the external environment, that duality falls away. And that is the kind of non-dual state that is described in certain forms of practice. And to quote the well-known 8th century yogini, Yeshe Sogyal, when you look within and observe, you will come to see yourself. Yet there is no thing to see. This seeing is itself recognition. It is what we call the view. And then something that actually is very close to me, and something that I work with a lot in my own practice, is this extraordinary prayer that comes from the third Karmapa. And I'd like to just read this to you, and this will be my next to last slides, where it said, all phenomena are projections of the mind, yet there is no mind. It is empty of any essence. Empty yet unobstructed, it can manifest as anything. Investigating it with care, may we cut through to the ground. Non-existent self-appearances are mistaken for objects. Due to ignorance, self-awareness is mistaken for a self. We wander through samsara under the sway of dualistic fixation. May we completely cut the root of ignorance and confusion. Mind does not exist, for even the Buddhas do not see it, yet neither does it not exist. It is the basis of all samsara and nirvana. This is not a contradiction, but a unity, the middle way. May the stream of effortless experience flow without ceasing. Clinging to good experiences freed on its own. The confusion of negative thoughts is naturally purified into basic space. Ordinary mind is beyond being accepted or rejected. It cannot be lost or gained. May we realize this freedom from concepts, the truth of reality itself. Beings have always been Buddhas by their very nature, yet not knowing this, they wander endlessly in samsara. For those beings who experience suffering without end, may overwhelming compassion take birth in our minds. In the moment of love, with the unceasing force of unbearable compassion, the truth of the empty essence nakedly dawns. This unity is the unerring supreme path. And finally, I want to end with something very different, and it is from Nelson Mandela. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin, or his background or religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richie. And now we're going to ask Al to offer us a response. So we're just going to make a transition here online. And I'm sure Al is out there somewhere.
Here I am. Thank you, John.
There he is. Al, could you unmute, please? He is unmuted? Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Richie, for both a
1 second,
really...
Al. We're just getting the audio together here.
Oh, okay. Tell me when you're ready.
Al, we're working on the audio.
Okay.
Go ahead, Al.
All right. How's that? Are you able to hear me? Testing 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Richie. Both a stimulating and encouraging talk, and also thank you especially for your dedication in the Healthy Minds program, bringing science to the question of how effective well-being interventions can be scaled and made more accessible. I think as several participating in this symposium very well know, this is a quite challenging research area and very difficult to conduct these kinds of studies that you were describing. So your talk stimulated several reflections, but I want to focus on a few that were most salient for me. The findings you reviewed from the Surgeon General's first report are striking and, of course, quite distressing. We seem to have collectively become more socially isolated and are spending less time with in-person social engagement, even before the pandemic. And this has several, as you pointed out, mental and physical health consequences. In that second report, the Surgeon General also described the negative correlation between the time that adolescents spend on social media and various mental health problems. There, of course, are also several notable examples of teens interacting in very cruel ways on social media. You described what strike me as important differences between the wet and analog biology of in-person social interaction and the relatively impoverished set of such features present in current digital social media, even the Zoom interface, allowing me to speak with you today. Even the case you made for innate basic goodness, I wondered about how best to understand these negative correlations of digital social media engagement with various measures of prosociality. For example, could the absence of so many of those wet and analog biology components in digital social media be removing critical releasers of innate basic goodness? Or does the impoverishment of these components potentially create greater need for those online to fill in with conditioned, self-generated predictions that create a kind of delusive intersubjectivity that can seem to them both true and real? I noticed while listening to your presentation how easy it can be for me to slip into a reification of even such concepts as innate basic goodness, temporarily losing awareness, as John Dunn and other presenters reminded us, and as you brought us back to at the end of your talk, that such words are simply pointers toward highly contingent, interdependent, and impermanent processes. Your approach, Richie, in the Healthy Minds program strikes me as implicitly recognizing this. teaching feasible practices to encourage and perhaps maybe disinhibit aspects of those processes, giving rise to what we point toward with that phrase, innate basic goodness. Finally, I also wondered about the interesting findings you reported from your Healthy Minds program. The observation that quite brief daily practice can lead to meaningful long-term outcomes, for example, in the teacher's study, might initially surprise some experienced meditation practitioners that are here today. I wonder what component processes in your interventions might have facilitated the long-term outcomes you observed, and you alluded to some of them, I think. And also what continuing studies might be necessary to address this. So I'll end my reflections here and welcome any response you might have, and thank you again, Richie.
Thank you, Al. My biggest response is I wish you were here so I can give you a hug. I miss you, Al. You have been such a part of these gatherings, and your presence, your steadiness has really been so vital in enabling all this to go on. So just a brief diversion and reflection about that. I really appreciate your comments a lot, and I'll pick up on one of them. You ask about what may be some of the key ingredients or ingredient that enables the kind of longer term change that we're seeing with such brief periods of practice, and also asking the question whether that's surprising to many of us here in the Zendo, many of whom are very long-term practitioners. In some sense, in my own way, I would include myself among them. And thinking about, wow, how can 30 days of 4.5 minutes a day produce these kinds of effects? And I have a few reflections about that. One is that, first of all, very consistently across many of these different kinds of studies, there's one generalization that I think can be made, and that is that folks who start off worse in a variety of different ways are benefited more from these kinds of practices. As a generalization, I think that is true across a number of different kinds of studies. And in some sense, that's not that surprising that people who are starting out from a lower baseline have more room to move in some sense. And so it's not that surprising that you see bigger change with them, but it's also very hopeful. And it also suggests that it actually doesn't take much to get these components of the mind awakened again, or the excavation does not require that much. It really can happen pretty easily, at least for certain aspects of this. And, we're not claiming that these short practices are going to lead to awakening, but they may bring a person to the path. And they certainly are providing some relief in terms of psychological distress. One of the things that I think is important to reflect on is that the kind of program that we're working with is not a mindfulness program. It's, we typically don't even use that word, and it's one of several components. I often say that if all one does is mindfulness, it would be like going to the gym and just working out on your upper body, which would be good for your upper body, but after a while, it can actually lead to some imbalance. And so we need all of these different components to promote human flourishing. And so I think that programs which are more comprehensive perhaps will be more effective. The other thing that I'll say, and this will be the last thing to respond, is that a big area for future work is more personalized training, because one of the convictions that I have is that one size does not fit all. And one of the reasons why the strategy that we've adopted may be helpful is because it's giving people a lot of different kinds of practices. It's likely that some of those will appeal more to some kinds of people and others will mesh better with other kinds of people. But I think we could do a better job of discovering how to do that kind of matching. And this is really ushering in the potential for more personalized well-being training, if you will, which I think is on the horizon and something that is within our reach. Thank you for your comments, and great to have you part of this, Al.
So I see now we're a bit after 11 o'clock, and we do have another presentation this morning coming from Adam. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a break now. Shall we say 10 minutes, Roshi? Is that okay? Let me just double check that. So it's 8 minutes. So we'll come back at 11:15, and we'll hear from Adam. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good break.